Prime Video's The Rings of Power, after a long wait, is finally here. We're even through the first 3 episodes already. So I decided, before doing the second part of my Concerning Middle-earth video, I would get some stuff up about the show and attempt to voice some of my thoughts. I will be giving a review with spoilers in this video for the first 3 episodes, so if you have not yet watched, I advise you to come back to this video after you have. First off, let's get one thing stated straight away. This is an adaptation. I don't expect it to match up perfectly to Tolkien's writings, as Amazon only has the rights to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, not The Silmarillion. As well, sometimes changes are necessary. The Peter Jackson films, which are generally beloved, did this a bit and it generally worked. Be it for pacing, simplicity, or just time constraints, no adaptation from book to screen is ever 100% accurate, nor should it be. So let's start looking at this per episode, and then I will give my overall thoughts. This will also be somewhat of a breakdown, but will be very general with bits of specific lore sprinkled in. So I think starting off the first episode with Galadriel narrating is a great callback to the start of the Peter Jackson films. I do wish the prologue was a little beefier in terms of the first age, but we are likely seeing the result of contract and right issues where they can only show so much. Sadly, callouts later in the show do suffer because of this. My one huge gripe throughout these initial scenes that only have elven characters is that they are typically speaking in the common tongue, but will briefly say things in Quenya, I believe, but it could be Sindarin. I'd really rather they spoke mostly in their native tongues, but I get how that could be off-putting for viewers, so I won't really ding the show for that. Once Galadriel and her company advance to the stronghold of Sauron, which we never get a name for, you can get a sense of her power and knowledge. Make no mistake, Galadriel is quite old by this point and a very powerful elf. She was born in Valinor, she beheld the light of the 2 trees, and she is from the royal line of the Noldor, being descended from Finwë, the first king of the Noldor. I have 0 issues at all with her being able to handle a sword and decimate a troll. It would honestly be weird if she could not do that. After defeating the troll, the rest of the scene actually serves to illustrate something about the elves in Tolkien's works. They don't like killing each other. The kinslayings done by the Noldor in the First Age were seen as irredeemable acts. Galadriel did not take part in those per Tolkien's writings, at least. Next, we get to the Harfoots, which, obviously being a precursor to the hobbits that we would see in the Third Age in the Shire, are a bit less serious than everyone else in Middle-earth. However, the show does a great job making the evolution from this nomadic people believable. I'm guessing the creature we see at the end of the sequence is either a Wog or a Wog precursor, since they are from the Misty Mountains, which are very close to where the Harfoots reside, but it could also just be a wolf. Moving on, we get to the first appearance of Elrond in the show. I'm currently on the fence about his portrayal in the show so far, and this ties into the larger issue with the show not really letting you know how far into the Second Age this is. Elrond appears to lack experience and almost has to feel as someone newly appointed as an aide to Gil-galad, but he shouldn't be. He should already be a few thousand years old at this point, being born at the end of the First Age. That aside, I love the look of Lindon here. I think they really nailed the aesthetic. This is where it really starts to feel like Middle-earth for me. There's also a lot of imagery pointing to Eärendil, which feels wholly appropriate. I also find it strange that there's this separation between Gil-galad and Galadriel. They are kin, both descended from Finwë, and are cousins. With so many of their family having died in the First Age, I feel like they would not have this separation, but I suppose it isn't impossible and may very well be due to the bullheadedness that Galadriel displays in these early episodes. Returning to the Harfoots, they make their second appearance in this show, and this really tried to hammer home their isolationism. It mostly works, but it seems more like they are blindly pointing to tradition rather than the common sense of, we're a small nomadic people who can't really defend ourselves. Back to Lindon, we get to my biggest holdup lore-wise about the show so far, in the ceremony for the returning soldiers. It seems that, in this version of Middle-earth, Gil-galad decides who goes to Valinor. Ignoring the ban placed on Galadriel returning by the Valar, per Tolkien's writings, after the First Age, any elves were permitted to come to Valinor once they had grown weary of the world, sparing the agitators who encouraged the Noldor to return to Middle-earth in the first place. So it seems weird that it would be an honor to be granted. Even more strange is Elrond indicating that no one has ever refused the honor because basically, all the Noldor who stayed in Middle-earth after the first age refused the honor of going back to Valinor. And here we get to what has clearly been a point of contention for many in the Tolkien fandom. Essentially, there are multiple reasons that Galadriel wished to stay in Middle-earth. The show is focusing on defeating Sauron completely being the sole reason. In the lore, Galadriel did indeed want this, but she also wished basically to create beauty in Middle-earth and watch over it. I'm guessing this desire will be shown later in the show as a means of character development. In Elrond, the way he is somewhat dismissive of the experience and trauma that Galadriel has had is also very strange to me. Galadriel is far older than him, as well as, I would argue, far more knowledgeable and wise. That said, he does show some great persuasion skills here, but I wish he was more of a leader and less of a diplomat. I'm guessing this is another instance where they need to have him develop as a character into the leader that he will eventually be. Now we get our first look at Arondir, a Sylvan elf, and I think through the first 3 episodes he is my favorite new character, maybe my favorite overall in the show. He comes off as the most authentic and most like how I would imagine an elf from Tolkien's works to be. There is a calm coolness about him, but emotion is still displayed when it is needed. As well, the detail on the armors for the elves in the Southlands are exceptional. Additionally, I have no issue with him being in love with the human Bronwyn. We know very few pairings between elves and men, but the only ones we do know of are basically royalty, which is why it makes sense that they are the only ones to come into tales and stories. The history of Arda is quite long, and for there to be only 3 instances of coupling between the 2 races is just odd. Next, we get our introduction to Theo, who is Bronwyn's son, who immediately breaks into a barn and steals a broken blade bearing the same symbol that Galadriel found in the north. Clearly this blade is tied in some way to Sauron, and the best bet, in my mind, is that it's some sort of Morgul blade. I expect the story for this blade to develop over multiple seasons, however, and not just in this one season. Back to Lindon, we get a bit of redemption for Elrond here, as it is indicated he was just following the orders of his king, and he may not necessarily have agreed with sending Galadriel away. Gil-galad comes off a bit more manipulative than I would have thought he would be portrayed. And we get our first appearance of Celebrimbor a bit sooner than I would have thought as well. Back to the Harfoots, I'm hoping I'm not the only person who enjoys Sadoc's surly attitude in this episode. He's a grump for sure, but there's definitely some knowledge hidden there, and I would guess that he protects it for good reason. I also hope we get some indication in later episodes of what troubles Nori's father, Largo, got into before that would make Sadoc react like this towards Nori. For Arondir and Bronwyn's last appearance in this episode, they get a more combative moment that seems a little bit forced. Like Arondir's dialogue was made to explicitly get a reaction from Bronwyn, even though it seems a little out of character for him. And then we also get the final shot of Hordern that leaves a cliffhanger that I think most of us probably saw coming. Now we get to my second most worrisome point about the show lore-wise. This representation of Valinor feels more like to me how I would expect it to be in the Third Age, perhaps. There should be enchantments about the sea, yes, but the land of Valinor was said to be visible from Numenor, at least Tol Eressëa, which is where the elves of Middle-earth would sail to initially. This seems more like passage off the plane of Arda almost, where Middle-earth resides. And of course, I don't think anyone thought, even just because of the marketing and trailers, that Galadriel would actually go to Valinor. And finally, we get to the Meteor Man, or the Stranger as he is called in the show. His arrival obviously portends some serious things, since anything flying through the sky tends to be an omen, at least in ancient and medieval times. My initial guess is that he is a Maya, but only time will tell. With the start of episode 2, we get our first look at the title sequence for the show, and it's fine. I hope it gets remade or altered for later seasons, but it seems somewhat generic and lacks the specific charm of something like the Game of Thrones intro. We start with Galadriel adrift in the ocean. I will note that they did a good job adding some of our own constellations and making sure they're visible, since, for Tolkien, Arda is our own world. I'm guessing this is showing Galadriel using the stars to tell her which way to swim, as she is obviously heading back towards Middle-earth. Then it's a quick cut back over to Nori, who has found our Meteor Man. Yes, I'm going to keep calling him that until I know his name, because it's more entertaining and I like it better than the Stranger. A point is made here about the fire not being hot, which does point to some strange magic being involved. And I believe this was also mentioned by Galadriel's soldiers in Sauron's fortress that it was so evil they could not feel the heat from the fire. The drawing of the fire back into him when he calms down points to him having some control over it as well. The cart shenanigans are not entirely unsurprising, but the little bit of comedy is definitely needed since all the other storylines are so serious. At this point, Arondir and Bronwyn have reached Hordern, and the finding of no bodies is very different for orcs who tend to just kill. This mystery will soon be answered though, in the next episode, so we'll talk about it there. Hardly surprised as well that Arondir decided to go it alone in the tunnels, but I feel like it would have made more sense for his character to have waited and observed them first. After this, we get our first look at Eregion. It should be the primary city of Alston Ethel, and the design is okay. I would like more shots of it in the show since I'm not really sure how I feel about it yet. It seems to lack the grace of Lindon in my mind, but the elves of Eregion were a more ambitious bunch. The first interaction we see between Elrond and Celebrimbor is fixated initially on Feanor's hammer. This is another instance where a deeper prologue would have helped the average viewer, because they likely have no idea who Feanor is. With the focus placed on the hammer, I'm going to make a bold prediction and say it will end up with Sauron and maybe be used to craft the One Ring. Here we also get a look at Celebrimbor's ambition. Being the grandson of Feanor, this seems completely in character and makes you wonder what exactly he is willing to sacrifice. However, we also get the strange arbitrary deadline of spring for his forge tower, which seems weird for an immortal elf. This was either just a plot choice to move things along, or someone else is already present in the background, starting to pull the strings. As the two elves go to visit the dwarves, we get a slight change to the lore here. In Tolkien's works, the elves of Eregion would have been very friendly with the dwarves of khazad-dum at this point. This is likely where we fall prey to the compressed timeline they had to adopt for these shows, however. If you are unaware about the compressed timeline, Tolkien's lore for the Rings of Power takes place over almost 2,000 years. This show will obviously not be doing that because they would have to constantly recast the mortal characters on the show and introduce new characters all the time. Straight off the bat, khazad-dum looks fantastic. I love that the mirrors were specifically included, and you get a sense of how the dwarves can actually live and survive down in the Misty Mountains. It looks incredible as well as functional. Elrond at this point seems like he is a being of many connections, which again doesn't really play into him being so naive. However, this scene also shows that while knowledgeable, he isn't all that wise yet. This is yet again another result likely of the compressed timeline. Returning to the Harfoots, we get an interesting sequence of Meteor Man finally speaking actual words. Mana Ure is Quenya, and if you go strictly off the captions, it can be translated to, "What is fire?" However, this seems to be a typo with the Macron missing over the second A in Mana, as he's likely saying Mana Ure as in blessed fire. This is cut with Largo breaking his ankle, to which I have to say, there's a good bit where someone definitely could have helped him and just no one did. Galadriel, at this point, is still adrift at sea, but eventually finds some humans adrift as well. I would be interested to know where the ship these survivors came from was headed. It isn't like humans sailed to Valinor, and there is no mention of Numenor. If they were just going to a different port in Middle-earth, they would likely have just held along the coasts. As well, the attack by the sea monster could have, I think, been a little bit more suspenseful, but I have no major issues with it. Back to khazad-dum, I don't think there was ever a chance that Elrond would be successful in this rite of Sigyn Tarag, but I'm also surprised he thought breaking the hammer would actually work. The friendship that Elrond seems to have discarded here will certainly be revitalized and should play to a pivotal moment in later seasons of the show. The fact that Durin continued to tend to the tree points simply to the fact that he missed this friendship with Elrond. Back to the drifters at sea, I find it odd that any elves are really convinced that orcs are truly eradicated from Middle-earth, which seems to generally be indicated in the show so far. Orcs have been a threat to elves since their return to Middle-earth, and I would think they are well aware of them surviving the sinking of Beleriand. Regardless, Halbrand seems to have slotted into the reluctant hero slot for this show, and we'll see if he even ends up being a hero. Now we pick up back with Bronwyn after she's been separated from Arondir. And back at her home, After the tavern, this is a better suspense moment, I think, than the sea creature attack earlier in the episode. The appearance of the orc cross-cut with Arondir going through the tunnels does keep the suspense high as well. I get that Arondir thinks he may be able to save some villagers, but this was high time to go and get reinforcements. It's pretty clear the orcs completely outsmarted him here. Getting back to Bronwyn and Theo, you get a sense of just how strong an orc is compared to regular humans, as this orc takes a considerable amount of punishment. That said, it is a little strange that there is only a single orc, but I guess we can chalk that up to this one being a scout. Regardless, Bronwyn is clearly going to be leading these people, and we'll see how many of them survive, the orcs that are definitely coming for them in later episodes. The continuation of the shipwreck scene leaves me on the fence about Halbrand. He clearly has some sense of destiny or duty that causes him to save Galadriel in this sequence. He could very well have untied the rope or just cut it and still survive just fine. Their storylines look to be intertwined for at least a good portion of this season, and I'm guessing they will save each other probably a few times. Meteor Man makes his next appearance, and the first thing that struck me about this scene was how reminiscent it is of Gandalf atop Isengard in the Fellowship of the Ring, at least initially. It takes a turn, however, once all the fireflies perish after interacting with this strange being. This either points to a more sinister nature to this individual, or that he has power that he simply cannot control. That he is looking for constellations is an interesting idea, as, like Galadriel before in this episode, they were often used for wayfinding in ancient times. Now we get a scene with Prince Durin and his father, who is also Durin. While this may make sense for most viewers, it does somewhat go against the lore of the dwarves in Tolkien's works. For the dwarves, Durin is not really a family name that is passed down. They believe that Durin, one of the 7 original dwarves created by Aule, is reincarnated every so often, and the name is given to dwarves they believe to be his reincarnation. So obviously, having a father and a son have the name when both are still alive kind of goes against this. This change was likely made to make things simpler for viewers in my mind. Back to the show, however, there is a stage where the Elrond might be aware of something the dwarves have found in Khazad-dum. This clearly appears to be Mithril, which will also definitely come into play later in the series. In the penultimate scene of this episode, we get the return of the blade Theo stole in the first episode. Due to his wound during the orc encounter, some sort of dark magic occurs, and his blood is seemingly used to restore part of the blade. I also wouldn't be surprised if this binds the blade to him in some way, and I don't expect anything happy coming from this storyline. The last scene in this episode heralds the entrance of Numenor into the story. My bets for the mysterious figure on the ship that finds Galadriel and Halbrand was either Amandil or Elendil, but the answer is soon given in the next episode. Episode 3 starts off with Arondir's storyline, and we can immediately tell that he is not in a great position. The name Adar is brought up numerous times, but I believe this is an original character made for this show, so there is not much that can be said about his name from a lore perspective. We also get an answer to the question of why there were no corpses present in Hordern, since they've all been taken captive for slave labor by the orcs. What's interesting here is that we find Arondir's comrades are also in shackles and forced to labor. I have to wonder whether this would have been his fate regardless, or if we'll discover that they were captured while looking for Arondir. Galadriel and Halbrand are the next main characters to appear, and this is our first introduction to Numenor, but more importantly to Elendil, who should be a crucial character for this show. He certainly has a very commanding presence, and I think the casting here was spot on. The visuals here are fantastic as they approach Numenor, and what should be the capital city of Armenelos. The city was actually made a bit more crowded and populated than I would have thought, but I think that kind of makes sense for this point in Numenor's history. We also get the clear impression that they have not seen elves in a very long time, and they don't seem to want Galadriel in their city, much less on their island. Sadly, we also get Halbrand here, serving as a way to give Galadriel exposition. Going by the lore, the Numenorians would have been known in the Southlands by this point, but it seems the show has taken a different tact in having them possibly avoid Middle-earth altogether. I would wonder if this is another result of the compressed timeline. As has been pointed out by various other people on YouTube here, The white tree that is shown somewhat prominently in this episode is Nimloth, the White Tree of Numenor, given to Numenor by the Elves of Valinor, and this is the only area of the palace, for lack of a better word, that is in disrepair. I will also note here that on the walk up, Halbrand was extremely interested in the forge, which is something that will come into play later in the episode. Upon arriving in court, it was actually pretty fun to see Galadriel get her "My name is Maximus" moment a la Gladiator. Initially, I wasn't expecting Tarmiriel to be as hostile to elves as she appears here, but Galadriel does end up being very challenging to a queen in that queen's own court, which is likely never a good idea. Halbrand does display some charm and wiles here, which lend more to the idea that he is more than he appears. As we will find out shortly after, he also appears to be somewhat of a pickpocket, but I also get the feeling that Elendil kind of let the thieving occur. Right after this, unless you had subtitles on, is the first instance in which Elendil is actually named. Interestingly, in the lore, Pharazôn, who was regent in this episode, was good friends with Elendil's father, Amandil, and kept him as a close confidant for a long while, despite their opposing viewpoints. I'm currently unsure if the show will feature Amandil in any way, but I hope we at least get something, as his story in the lore is very interesting. They mention a single son for Elendil, which is also interesting as he has two, and the other receives a mention later in this episode. We also get an allusion of Muriel's father, Tar Palantir, meaning farsighted, who ruled before her. I expect him to make an appearance at some point in this season. Continuing with the famous Númenóreans, we get the first appearance of Isildur as he is training at sea. Interestingly, we see him look off towards what I think is Numenor and a voice whispers his name. We also get a show of athleticism here, showcasing the strength and agility for the Dunedain that is present in Isildur. Upon the beach, we see a new character created for the show, Isildur's sister Eärien. In the lore, there is never any mention made of Elendil's children sparing his two sons, but I don't really have any issues with this character being added in. We also receive a mention of Isildur's brother, who will no doubt come into this show at some point. Cutting over to the White Tree, Miriel speaks of the Valar, and we start to get hints of how she really thinks. I will note that I love the conversation about the meaning of Elendil's name, since, as I've seen it described on social media, it is perhaps the most Tolkien thing possible to start discussing the etymology of a name. It also seems to be insinuated here that Miriel is asking Elendil to kill Galadriel, but this will develop a bit more later. Heading back over to Middle-earth, we pick up on Arondir's storyline as him and his fellow soldiers are forced to work for the orcs. We get a bit of an exposition dump here, as it is indicated the orcs are searching for something that their leader Adar wants. There's also the first hint that Adar could be Sauron. This almost feels a bit too obvious for me, but there's definitely a chance that Adar is indeed the Dark Lord. As the orcs take notice of the conversation, I don't think it was any real secret that there would be a bad outcome from their defiance, despite what the head orc here pretended. The unease displayed by the elves here makes that clear as they sip from the canteen. Out of calamity, Arondir at least has the wits to accomplish what is needed and survey the land above the trenches. I can't help but note how much this view made me think of how the trenches of the First World War are often depicted, with it seeming very much like no man's land. Before he fells the tree, he does say "forgive me" in Quenya as well. Viewers were likely not greatly surprised to see that Galadriel escaped her captors, but I was somewhat surprised to see Elendil be so frank with her in a somewhat open space. Despite Galadriel being far older and knowledgeable than Elendil, he shows off some maturity that can only really be gained through parenthood, which Galadriel, I believe, at this point has yet to partake in. It is also good to hear more of Tolkien's languages as Elendil converses with Galadriel. I still wish they were more prevalent in the show so far, but I'm hoping to hear more once we get back to the storylines that have elves dealing with each other. Elendil refers to where he grew up, and this should be Romena, where they will go to just after this scene. Halbrand continues to show a deep fascination with the Númenórean forges here, along with an overly healthy amount of confidence. He continues to put more and more of that charm and charisma to work, but also shows some unbridled rage and combat skills when his thievery goes awry. I will note that he does warn them off and tries to get away, but I'm guessing this is more to keep attention away from himself than to spare the workers any harm. And unsurprisingly, this does appear to land him in jail. The Hall of Lore in Ravenna, to be honest, was a little underwhelming for me. I expected something a bit more grand having been built by Elros. We also get the reveal of the sigil that Galadriel has been seeing. Indeed, it is not a sigil at all, but a map of the Southlands that will soon take on a much darker visage. We then cut over to what I can only say is one of the creepier scenes that have been in the show, mostly thanks to the music track that plays underneath it. It did honestly take me a moment to realize this was the Harfoots during the celebration and not orcs racing through the woods. And I think it isn't really a mystery how Largo's dilemma with his injury will be resolved, and we'll get to that by the end of the episode. The stealing of the star charts serves for more comic relief, of course, but just after, our view of the Harfoots takes a much more serious turn, as they list out all their dead and pay tribute to them. This indicates what can be a somewhat brutal life for these people. It does get a little awkward when they all laugh about someone dying from bees, but I'll guess that allergies aren't widely known about in Middle-earth. This scene also has the Meteor Man finding the star charts left for him and accidentally setting one on fire, which makes me question whether he is in Maya or something else. But until we get confirmation on why he is in this state, it will be hard to make any real educated guesses. If you're wondering in the next scene who Sadak is referring to about a person being turned into a star, the reference here would be Elendil, the father of Elrond and Elros. It is somewhat heartless for all the talk of leaving people behind that they would knowingly put the Brandyfoots in the back, knowing that Largo is injured. This would almost certainly be leaving them behind, but maybe with less guilt? Back to Numenor, we get our first actual name of Anarion, Isildur's brother, who is sure to be an important character at some point in the show whenever he shows up. It is made clear here that Isildur does not necessarily want to follow in his father's footsteps, and it is also quite clear that Elendil is attempting to protect his family from the politics in Numenor. My current theory is that Anarion is one of the faithful who still support the Valar and the Elves. Elendil does as well, in secret, but he does not wish his children to join as a way of protecting them. Do note here that Eärien, being accepted as a builder's apprentice, is likely to be important later, otherwise they would not have drawn so much attention to it. As we see Galadriel visit Halbrand in prison, I have to wonder if he was transferred to a prison in Ravenna, or if she is here with Elendil, giving her some measure of free reign. Regardless, Galadriel has identified Halbrand as the rightful king of the Southlands, the title he appears to be running from. While she urges him to take up arms against the orcs and reclaim his lands, he does remind her that his ancestors swore a blood oath to Morgoth, hinting that darker things may be ahead for him. Just after this, we see Tar Miriel ascend the tower and converse with her father, telling him that the elf has arrived. This points that she is likely not as against the Valar and Eldar as she appears, but is just playing a part. Her father, Tar Palantir, was known for his foresight and, I would guess in this instance, foretold of Galadriel coming to Numenor. We return to the Harfoots and we finally get the most common sense answer to the Brandyfoot's dilemma: have the giant pull the cart. I think we all pretty much saw this coming, as it is the simplest solution to their dilemma. The final area we visit for this episode is the Southlands, where Arondir and his allies are still captured. I don't really have any issues with the escape, at least until the warg comes into play. First off, the CG here is a bit off, and it was very distracting at first view, but once the warg starts moving, it looks a little better at times, and then definitely worse at others. In regards to the tactics of the elves, I don't know why they all decided to go with the warg one at a time. These were soldiers in a unit together, and they should know the best way to overcome a foe like this is to swarm it from all sides. Regardless, I feel like this was set up to let Arondir shine, which is fine since he is still my favorite new character in the show so far, and the outcome of them escaping the trenches is quite predictable, sadly, and leaves Arondir pretty isolated. In the very last scene of this episode, we have Arondir being brought before Adar. I would like to note here the very Nazgul-ish gauntlet that Adar wears, but it appears to only be on his left hand. I do notice elven ears, but the image is quite blurry and hard to make out. I will also note here that Adar is an elvish word and it translates to father. Since we've now gone through all 3 episodes and done an overview and some sort of review of them, I'm going to go to my general thoughts now. Overall, this does distinctly feel like a logical stepping stone to the Middle-earth that we will see in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The elves have already reached the height of their power and unless their shells are what they used to be in Beleriand, and the men of Middle-earth are generally leaderless and somewhat downtrodden. Again, the backstory of the First Age could have been a little bit more filled in, but this is probably rights issues. For example, I don't even know if they have the rights to show the map of Beleriand, because when the elves are first coming out of Valinor in the prologue, and the map they show is Middle-earth in the Second and Third Age, not in the First Age. Sadly, this does make many lore references in the show completely lost on casual viewers who are not as steeped in Tolkien's lore as other people are. It also does not seem like the identity of the Mystery Man or the Stranger, Meteor Man, whatever you want to call him, is not going to be resolved anytime soon. The Harfoots clearly have no idea who he is, and it will take someone more knowledgeable to fill in the gaps for us. I will say the episodes have got progressively better as they've gone along, with episode 3 easily being the best of the ones they've released. I am, however, eagerly awaiting episode 4 to see if we get a return to Eregion and khazad-dum and some developments of those storylines. That should be very entertaining. As usual, I do want to say thanks for watching the breakdown of the first 3 episodes of the Rings of Power Season 1. Questions I have for any viewers is, what are you most eager to see in the next few episodes, and what do you think the Stranger or Meteor Man really is? I'm curious to see your responses in the comments. Thanks for watching.